Boom! The entire small kiliocosm was shaking violently. No matter where one was, they could sense obvious tremors. In fact, those one-star supremacies even had a feeling that their rules were being torn apart. Of course, this was not because their rules were being torn apart, but because the rules of the small kiliocosm were being torn apart. All cultivators who sensed the rules could sense it. The rules of the small kiliocosm were torn apart. This was simply as if a cataclysm had arrived. After all, even a 3-star supremacy could not break the rules of the small kiliocosm. From a certain perspective, the capacity of a small kiliocosm was actually at the level of a kiliocosm sovereign. It was just that once one became a kiliocosm sovereign or an ancestral devil, they could completely control their own strength and could easily blast apart 10 or 100 small kiliocosms. However, in terms of capacity, or rather realm, a small kiliocosm was actually comparable to a kiliocosm sovereign. Only someone with the capacity or realm of a kiliocosm sovereign could break the rules of a small kiliocosm. The tremors just now clearly did not come from a kiliocosm sovereign, but from another small kiliocosm. Lin Feng stared intently at a certain stretch of void in the distance. He had already seen a magnificent small kiliocosm falling violently like a meteor, crashing into the small kiliocosm. Countless rules wreaked havoc. The small kiliocosm naturally had an instinctive reaction. The rules were shaking and intertwining with each other. However, how could they drive away another small kiliocosm? Boom! There was another violent tremor. From another direction, another small kiliocosm collided. Originally, the locations of the 3 small kiliocosms were constantly changing, and there were no fixed trajectories. However, who would have thought that 3 small kiliocosms could collide? This was simply a 1 in a million chance. The probability was extremely low. Lin Feng's expression was extremely solemn. He muttered in a low voice, "The cataclysm has arrived. Supremacy Divine Jade. The cataclysm has arrived. I want to go to the place where the small kiliocosms collide to take a look. It would naturally be best if I can remedy it. If I can't, I have to minimize the losses." With that, Lin Feng stepped forward and disappeared into the void. This day has finally arrived. A tauren with curved horns and faint flames spewing out of his nostrils looked excitedly at a huge hole in front of him. His entire body was incomparably huge, like a small mountain. A huge hole appeared when the 2 small kiliocosms collided. Even though a large amount of rules were wreaking havoc in the hole, almost forming a forbidden zone that only applied for ordinary lifeforms. He was the tauren leader with the noblest bloodline, a top 2-star supremacy with several 100 trillion worlds. He had been waiting for this day for too long. Our king had said that to become a 3-star supremacy, we have to maraud and plunder. Our world has almost been plundered clean. Moreover, we are very far from the epical cataclysm. Even the medium kiliocosm factions are unwilling to descend. Fortunately, there is always a way out. We obtained news of the collision of small kiliocosms. All these years, we have been making preparations. The tauren leader stared intently at the hole. He was the vanguard, and was here to first detect the strength of the small kiliocosms that collided. Actually, this was also a gamble. No matter the strength, conflicts would definitely arise when 2 small kiliocosms collided. The difference was that the stronger one would obtain an advantage. The tauren leader did not know the situation in the other small kiliocosm. Moreover, this was a collision between 3 small kiliocosms. Although no medium kiliocosm faction had descended in his world, that might not be the case for the other 2 small kiliocosms. There were countless medium kiliocosm forces spread throughout the small kiliocosms. With 3 small kiliocosms as well as the medium kiliocosm factions, the relation between the forces were very complicated. The tauren knew very well that if he was not careful, he might even become a martyr. Tauren army, get ready. With the tauren leader's order, a large number of taurens behind him immediately formed an army. All of them were 1-star controllers. There were so many of them that it was unbelievable. There were about 10,000 of them. How terrifying were 10,000 1-star supremacies. In fact, There were no celestial devils in this small kiliacosm. They had all been killed. There were no medium kiliacosm factions either. They felt that the epical cataclysm was too far away, and it was too barren. Descending would simply be a waste of resources. Hence, this small kiliacosm was one of the rare worlds that was completely unified and controlled by the local controller faction. Even a 100 trillion level supremacy, like the Tauran, was only one of the vanguards of the king. The Tauran army was waiting. This was because the two small kiliacosms had only just collided. The small kiliacosm also had its own rules for operation, and also contained the small kiliacosm origin. They were both entangled with each other, or rather determining who was stronger. Both were rejecting each other. Even if a hole had appeared, they could not set off until the hole had completely stabilized. Otherwise, that terrifying storm of rules would be enough to completely annihilate the Tauran army. Swoosh! In the void, a figure emerged from the spatial passage and stepped in front of the huge hole. Lin Feng stood quietly in the void. He saw the hole in the distance. It was simply too huge, deep and dark, like a black hole, making it impossible to see the situation on the other side clearly. In particular, the two completely different rules were intertwining, entangling, and even forming a storm of rules that made Lin Feng's heart palpitate. Even he would probably be in danger once he entered it. It had to be known that the current Lin Feng was a 100 trillion level supremacy, and not an ordinary 100 trillion level supremacy. He had 600 trillion worlds. The current Lin Feng had attained the combat power of 600 trillion worlds. After 100 years of cultivation, Lin Feng's strength had increased by more than tenfold. This was the result of the plundering in the celestial devil world. However, only after exhausting all the boundary stones and the world origin did Lin Feng acquire his current strength. This was also why he could kill the 4 supremacies and more than 30 descenders with a flip of his palm. However, the combat power of 600 trillion worlds did not give Lin Feng any sense of security. In fact, when he saw the hole formed by the collision of the two small kiliacosms, Lin Feng felt his heart palpitate slightly. Before such power, what was a mere 600 trillion worlds of combat power worth? Lin Feng tried to mobilize the other rules of his internal kiliacosm domain. He was a true controller who transformed into a universe. He had countless internal kiliacosm domains, so there were also countless kiliacosm domain rules. The invisible kiliacosm domain rules quickly extended towards the whole. However, as soon as the kiliacosm domain rules extended, before they could even approach the hole, they were torn into pieces by the terrifying kiliacosm storm. At the same time, it even affected Lin Feng's internal kiliacosm domain. It caused his internal kiliacosm domain to experience violent tremors, before actually collapsing completely. This scene shocked Lin Feng incomparably. Even though he had lost a kiliacosm domain, it was actually not much of a loss to Lin Feng. With Lin Feng's current combat power of 600 trillion worlds, forget about a mere kiliacosm domain, even 10 kiliacosm domains were nothing. However, this made Lin Feng truly realize how terrifying the rules of a small kiliacosm were. Compared to the rules of a small kiliacosm, his kiliacosm domain rules were far inferior by countless times. Could this be what actual kiliacosm sovereign level power is like? A thought flashed through Lin Feng's mind. Lin Feng had actually come into contact with the power of a kiliacosm sovereign before. He had even used the rules of time to deal with the kiliacosm sovereign's power. However, at that time, the kiliacosm sovereign's power that Lin Feng was resisting had been weakened by the small kiliacosm by 99%, leaving only a little power. Although it was still very strong, it could no longer be considered the true dower of a kiliacosm sovereign. This event caused Lin Feng to make a wrong judgment about a kiliacosm sovereign. But now, Lin Feng had truly come into contact with a little power unleashed when the rules of two small kiliacosms were attacking at full force. When the small kiliacosm fought at full power, they were comparable to true kiliacosm sovereigns, and it was considered kiliacosm sovereign level power. Before this power, even a trace of it was not something a mere 100 trillion level supremacy like Lin Feng could compare to. Forget about a 100 trillion level supremacy, even a 3-star supremacy could do nothing against such power. Lin Feng could only wait quietly. He knew very well that when two small kiliocosms collided, if they were about the same size as each other under the entanglement, the whole would grow larger and larger before finally stabilizing completely. At that time, he would be able to enter and exit freely. Seeing that the rules were wreaking havoc, and it seemed like it would last for some time, Lin Feng deliberated if he should leave first to see the place where the other small kiliocosm collided. Buzz. Suddenly, the hole in the small kiliocosm seemed to have more than doubled in size. Violent rules wreaked havoc, entangling madly. This time, the victor seemed to have been determined. Lin Feng felt the rule storm gradually weaken, and the two small kiliocosms stopped shaking. Even the rules around them disappeared at once. Huh? It failed. Lin Feng's heart skipped a beat. He could sense that the rules of the small kiliocosm seemed to have disappeared. Of course, this did not affect Lin Feng, nor did it affect the other controllers. They would not face any suppression from the world. Once a controller reached a certain realm, especially a 1-star or 2-star controller, they would possess great power and kiliocosm domain rules themselves. They would not be suppressed by other worlds at all. This applied to both the small kiliocosm and the medium kiliocosm. As the rules of the small kiliocosm dissipated, and the whole stabilized, the tremors of the small kiliocosm gradually disappeared. Everything seemed to have returned to its previous state. However, the pitch-black hole reminded everyone that not everything had returned to its original state. Behind the hole was another completely different small kiliocosm. Swoosh! 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 At this moment, many controllers appeared. All of them gathered around the new dark domain supremacy? It's indeed dark domain supremacy. This is troublesome. He's a 100 trillion level supremacy. Previously, even when the 4 great supremacies joined forces to suppress him, they failed. They were even killed. How savage. I just received the news. I originally thought that with the 4 great supremacies and more than 30 trillion level supremacies, it would be a piece of cake to annihilate the Epic Alliance. But the outcome really surprised me. They were killed by the dark domain supremacy alone. The foundation of the Epic Alliance is really unfathomable. In a short period of time, it has nurtured the dark domain supremacy to this extent. It's really incredible. The way these descenders looked at Lin Feng became vaguely wary. In the past, the descenders all had high and mighty attitudes, and acted as if they looked down on all the controllers of the small kiliocosms. Even though Lin Feng had once ruthlessly killed descenders from 3 factions, it still did not change their attitudes and perspectives. This time, the attitudes of these descenders changed unanimously. After all, Lin Feng was too vicious and savage this time. There were a total of 4 10 trillion level supremacies leading a team of more than 30 trillion level supremacies. Even if the Celestial Devils and the Epic Alliance joined forces back then, they probably would not be able to resist such a powerful lineup. However, Lin Feng alone had rendered all their efforts useless. They suffered heavy losses, and were even completely annihilated. Not a single descender survived. Lin Feng's reputation was too vicious. No matter how proud these descenders were, they did not dare to underestimate Lin Feng. Lin Feng swept his gaze across these descenders, then ignored them. He could not stop these descenders. Moreover, he knew very well that from today onwards, he would probably be in trouble. Many kiliocosm sovereigns would definitely open dissension passages again. At that time, powerful supremacies might descend. Even some kiliocosm sovereigns who had grudges with Lin Feng in the past would also send down powerful supremacies. In fact, it was not impossible for him to be a 3-star supremacy. After all, as the 3 small kiliocosms collided, the epical cataclysm was brought forward. Even if only the small kiliocosm Lin Feng was facing the epical cataclysm, in reality, once the epical cataclysm erupted, it would trigger the epical cataclysm in the other 2 small kiliocosms completely. At that time, an unprecedented epical cataclysm would occur. Those who were not kiliocosm sovereigns would all be reduced to ashes. They're here. There's movement in the hole. Suddenly, the gazes of the descenders were all fixed on the hole. They had all descended with missions to seize the initiative and complete His Majesty the Kiliocosm Sovereign's plan. Then, it was very important to understand the situation of the other 2 small kiliocosms. Lin Feng also stared intently at the hole. He also wanted to know who was coming out of the hole. Boom! Slight tremors passed through the small kiliocosm, and the hole shook violently. At the same time, a huge foot stepped out of the hole. At the same time, a low roar sounded. A giant with 2 horns on his head, who looked completely like a minotaur, walked out of the hole. He emitted a terrifying, bloody and savage aura. In particular, there was the surging world power. Accompanied by kiliocosm domain rules, it spread in all directions as soon as he entered the small kiliocosm. I am the god of Torrens. On the orders of my king, I hereby conquer this world. Those who stop my army shall die. The Tauren leader called himself the god of Torrens. As soon as he stepped out of the hole, he unleashed all his strength. He released a majestic aura without restraint, seemingly turning the surroundings into a purgatory. The expressions of all the descenders changed slightly. Under the pressure of this terrifying aura, the descenders actually showed signs of struggling to hold out. After all, this unfamiliar life form called itself the god of Torrens. It was a powerful supremacy with several 100 trillion worlds. Boom! As soon as the god of Torrens stepped out, his gaze swept across the many descenders at once. However, his face was completely unmoved, and he appeared very calm. Come in, Tauren army. Help me to annihilate this world and offer it to our king. The god of Torrens' gaze was cold. With a light wave of his hand, a dazzling light suddenly appeared in the hole behind him. Immediately after, terrifying auras erupted, and there were even low shouts. Conquer the world and dedicate it to our king. Unified shouts came from the hole, slamming hard into everyone's hearts like heavy hammers. Even though these people were all dignified descenders and supremacies with extraordinary experiences in the medium kiliocosm, their minds were still shaken. Faced with the scene before them, they felt like they could not believe their eyes. One ox-like life form after another flew out of the hole. Moreover, every one of them seemed to be a 1-star supremacy. They could be said to be the best of the best. This power was enough to sweep through the entire small kiliocosm, invincible and undefeatable. Who would have thought that such a terrifying force could actually appear in another small kiliocosm? Who exactly are you? Could it be a medium kiliocosm faction? But I've never heard of any kiliocosm sovereign with such a group of ox-like life forms. Terrifying. It's really too terrifying. Not only are they 1-star supremacies, they even have a strong murderous aura. There are even a great many of them. Under the lead of this god of Torrens, they're truly terrifying. Many descenders tensed. They felt that the matter seemed to have already exceeded their range of control. They were here to make arrangements in advance, and even wanted to obtain some benefits. But from the looks of it now, how was this profitable? It was clearly a rather dangerous matter. You are the controllers of this small kiliocosm? You are too weak. I can sense the rich aura of resources here. TSK, you actually wasted such abundant resources instead of using them. What a waste. My king ought to conquer this place. The god of Torrens reached out and grabbed. A trident immediately appeared in his hand. It was incomparably huge and emitted traces of divine light. Then, he raised the divine trident and waved it at the descenders. Bang, bang, bang. Those descenders seemed to have been crushed by a huge force all of a sudden, and actually exploded instantly. Even the 100 billion level supremacies seemed unable to withstand a single strike from the god of Torrens. In an instant, there were heavy casualties. At least more than 10 descenders fell and were reduced to ashes. How dare you? We are factions of the medium kiliocosm. How dare you be so impudent? They're really insane. These Torrens are simply insane. Quick, inform His Majesty the kiliocosm sovereign that the situation has changed. He has to send down 100 trillion level supremacies, no, quadrillion level supremacies as soon as possible. In fact, 3-star supremacies have to descend to suppress them. Many descenders panicked. Their strength was not bad. Many of them were 10 billion level or 100 billion level supremacies, and there were even many trillion level supremacies. Some time ago, there were even 410 trillion level supremacies. In terms of overall strength, they were much stronger than the Epic Alliance. Of course, that was not counting the top-notch combatants. After all, there were number 100 trillion level supremacies among these descenders for the time being. All medium Kiliacosm factions deserved to die. When the god of Taurens heard the words of these descenders, he was instantly enraged, as if his taboo had been violated. His eyes turned bloodshot, and the killing intent on his body turned overwhelming as it swept towards those descenders. Immediately, countless descenders retreated in fear, and screams rose and fell. Just now, a casual move from the god of Taurens had killed at least 100 descenders. Seeing the actions of the god of Taurens, even Lin Feng found it a little unbelievable. These descenders all had medium Kiliacosm factions behind them. Even though Lin Feng had killed and intimidated many descenders, he did not dare to really make an enemy of all the descenders, let alone vent his anger on these descenders for no reason. However, this god of Taurens seemed to loathe descenders from the bottom of his heart. It was even as if he had a deep feud with them, and wished to kill all the descenders from the medium Kiliacosm. Lin Feng did not have any good feelings about these descenders, so he was naturally happy to let the god of Taurens kill them. However, he did not let his guard down against the god of Taurens. This god of Taurens and the Tauren army behind him were clearly very invasive. They had not come to this small Kiliacosm just to kill the descenders. Their true goal was to conquer this small Kiliacosm. You'll die too. The god of Taurens had no intention of letting Lin Feng off at all. The mighty world power swept towards Lin Feng like a flood. Although it was just a convenient move, its power was still rather terrifying. Even a 10 trillion level supremacy would find it very difficult to resist it. A sharp glint flashed across Lin Feng's eyes. At this moment, he already knew the stance of these Taurens. They wanted to conquer this world at all costs. The degree of danger was even more terrifying than that of celestial devils. Lin Feng of the Epic Alliance is here. Alien life forms, retreat at once. Lin Feng extended his palm and clapped gently against the mighty world power. Boom! The power of the world shook. Just the shockwaves of the clash between two terrifying bouts of world power had flattened an area of billions of kilometers. If the descenders had not all fled or been killed previously, there was no knowing how many supremacies would have died or been injured by a shockwave now. Even the shockwaves of a battle between entities at this level was something that ordinary supremacies could not resist. The god of Taurens' entire body shook. His huge body actually seemed to have withstood infinite force. There was a crackling sound, and he could not help but retreat for a few steps. Swoosh! The god of Taurens lifted his head and stared at Lin Feng in shock, as if he could not believe it. Are you also a descender? The god of Taurens took a few steps back. After completely stabilizing his body, he stared intently at Lin Feng. Lin Feng glanced at the god of Taurens, then shook his head and said indifferently, I'm not a descender. I'm an elder of the Epic Alliance, the Dark Domain Supremacy. This small Kiliacosm is the place where we cultivated, and we cannot tolerate outsiders wreaking havoc. You are outsiders. If you seek cooperation to discuss how to survive the epical cataclysm, I naturally welcome you. If you only want to invade and conquer this small Kiliacosm, we can only resort to killing. As soon as Lin Feng finished speaking, he slowly released the aura on his body. The pure and massive power of the dense array of worlds above his head felt suffocating. Even the expression of the god of Taurens could not help but change slightly. He knew very well that this dark domain supremacy in front of him was very likely a 100 trillion level supremacy like him, or even stronger. Whether they would war or make peace depended on a single decision by the god of Taurens. The god of Taurens glanced at dark domain supremacy, then at the descenders from the medium Kiliacosm. Then, he said in a muffled voice, there are actually so many descenders from the medium Kiliacosm in this world. The fact that you haven't expelled them is self-explanatory. You're bluffing. Ha! Lin Feng's gaze turned sharp as he stared at the god of Taurens. The god of Taurens laughed. He sneered at Lin Feng. He had almost been intimidated by Lin Feng. After all, he was the god of Taurens. Even in the small Kiliacosm, He was not bad among subordinates of the king. In fact, he was the vanguard. How could he not be shocked to encounter a controller who was not inferior to him as soon as he entered? However, the god of Torrens did not dare to disobey the order of the king. Moreover, he could already tell that Lin Feng was bluffing. There was nothing to be afraid of. You're bluffing, and I'm just a vanguard under my king. Under my king, there are countless vanguards like me. Under my king's lead, we will definitely annihilate this world. If the god of Torrens was still talking, but in the next moment, Lin Feng unexpectedly attacked directly. Die! Lin Feng did not listen to the god of Torrens' nonsense anymore. From his perspective, what the god of Torrens said was nonsense. The two parties were on different sides. Since they could not reach an agreement, they could only fight. Moreover, this was the first time both parties had come into contact. Neither could retreat. Worlds appeared above Lin Feng's head. There was even a huge chaotic lotus that stretched across the void. Waves of terrifying world power converged on the chaotic lotus, blotting out the entire Kiliacosm domain corridor. They were overwhelming, enveloping the god of Torrens and even the Tauran army. The god of Torrens also quickly reacted. He roared, "Tauran army, prepare for battle. Gore!" The Tauran army consisted of a total of 10,000 people. Now, this army had erupted. All of them were one-star supremacies, and there was no lack of powerful two-star supremacies. They formed a strange array. The god of Torrens suddenly entered the middle of the Tauran army. He appeared to be guarding the eye of the array. Waves of terrifying world power gathered. They could actually fuse tens of thousands of types of world power within the array. An even larger phantom of a Tauran appeared above the Tauran army. The power of this array instantly stimulated the power of the 10,000 one-star supremacies, and even fused with the power of the god of Torrens. It was even stronger. This array! Lin Feng's eyes narrowed slightly. Then, the chaotic lotus above his head suddenly sent down a blast. Boom! The huge phantom of the Tauran shook violently, as if it would collapse at any moment. However, it still held out against Lin Feng's power for a while. Even if it was on the verge of collapse now, it was already quite impressive. It had to be known that Lin Feng had the combat power of a total of 600 trillion worlds now. As for the god of Torrens, if Lin Feng was not wrong, he only had less than 200 trillion worlds. The difference was unimaginable. However, relying on this strange array, the Tauran army supported by it resisted a single strike from Lin Feng. Even though Lin Feng did not use his full strength, or even half of his strength, it was already commendable that they could withstand a single strike from Lin Feng. However, that was all. Lin Feng had only been testing him just now. But now, he was going all out. Boom! Another new power appeared. Not only did worlds appear above Lin Feng's head, Kiliacosm domains even appeared one after another. The terrifying power pressed down hard. At this moment, the power of 600 trillion worlds erupted all at once. The god of Torrens felt as if his entire body was about to be crushed. Even though he had used all his strength and the Tauran army had used all their strength, they still could not withstand it and were defeated. No! Our king will definitely annihilate this world. The god of Torrens roared angrily, looking very indignant. However, no matter how unwilling he was, it was difficult for him to resist the crushing force of the chaotic lotus. Thud! The Tauran army, including the god of Torrens, was instantly crushed into dust by Lin Feng's chaotic lotus. Their spirits were destroyed, and they were all annihilated. Lin Feng looked at the pitch-black hole with some hesitation. He could not fill or block this hole. This was only the vanguard. What if an even stronger supremacy came? There was even the king that the god of Torrens had always mentioned. How powerful was that entity? Could it be a 3-star supremacy? Lin Feng did not know. This was all he could do. He could not save the entire small Kiliacosm, at least not with his current strength. He could not defeat all enemies either. So what if he repelled the god of Torrens? There would still be the second, third, and even countless times. In fact, what about the other small Kiliacosm? What would happen? Moreover, descenders from the medium kiliacosm would definitely come down one after another. A cataclysm was ultimately a cataclysm. Human power could not stop it. Descenders. Lin Feng shifted his gaze away from the hole and looked at the descenders again. Many of them had been killed by Lin Feng previously, and now the god of torrents had suddenly barged in and killed many of them as well. They had even become somewhat easily spooked. When had dignified descenders ever received such treatment? When had they ever suffered such grievances? All of them had long communicated with the Kiliacosm sovereigns behind them, hoping that the Kiliacosm sovereigns could open the Ascension passage again and send down powerful supremacies to help them recover the dignity of the descenders. However, now was not the time. Lin Feng was vicious. These descenders did not dare to be impudent in front of Lin Feng. Hence, when Lin Feng looked over, these descenders actually felt fearful. It turned out that be it controllers in the medium kiliacosm or the small kiliacosm, all of them could feel fear. Those who were weak would feel fear. Even a glance would make them fearful. Lin Feng was hesitating, wondering if he should take down all these descenders today. However, he did not take action in the end. It was not that he was afraid, but that it was meaningless. After the three small kiliacosms collided with each other, the kiliacosm sovereigns could easily find the locations of the three small kiliacosms and open the dissension passages. It would be useless to kill these 100 billion or trillion level descender supremacies. What was the point? Hence, Lin Feng only glanced at these descenders. Then, with a flash, he entered the spatial passage and warped space to leave. The remaining descenders heaved a sigh of relief. That was too suffocating just now. Did we just escape death? It should be. I sensed that dark domain supremacy developed killing intent just now. Alas, when did dignified descenders like us fall to such a state? He even wanted to take us all down at once. Our strength is inferior. It's better to keep a low profile in the future and wait for the dissension passage to open. As for now, let's just wait patiently. The descenders lamented, but they also knew that the situation was changing rapidly at every moment. Now was not the time for descenders like them to show off their prowess. They could only keep a low profile. In another small kiliacosm, there was a magnificent palace floating in the void. It appeared to be the center of the entire small kiliacosm, and emitted a magnificent and holy aura. Your Majesty, the Tauran army has lost, but we still have hundreds of armies. Moreover, there is no lack of armies led by quadrillion-level supremacies. I am willing to be the vanguard of your Majesty to annihilate that world. A huge ape covered in golden fur knelt on one knee, a trace of battle intent in his eyes. The king sat upright on the throne. His body seemed to be enveloped in a layer of fog, preventing people from seeing his face clearly. However, no one dared to be impudent in front of the king. For a long time, the king was synonymous with blood and massacre. A word from the king could incite a boundless massacre. There's no hurry. I was a little rash when the three small kiliacosms collided. Let's send someone in to investigate the situation first. Yes, let the god of shadows go. He has a natural talent for stealth. Even top 2-star supremacies usually can't discover him. After the investigation is done, I'll decide on the next move, the king finally said. Yes, your Majesty. The golden ape did not dare to say anything else, and left respectfully. The king looked at the distant void as he muttered in a low voice, 3 small kiliacosms. If I can obtain a large amount of small kiliacosm origin, perhaps I can make a deal with the kiliacosm sovereigns. A kiliacosm sovereign level boundary stone. Even if I just become a pseudo-kiliacosm sovereign, it's still much better than stagnating in this small kiliacosm forever. I can't afford any mistakes this time. His voice low, the king's figure gradually disappeared without a trace. Swoosh. Lin Feng returned to the Epic Alliance headquarters and met Supremacy Divine Jade immediately. Elder Lin, how is it? Supremacy Divine Jade knew that Lin Feng had headed to the place where the 2 small kiliacosms collided. He was burning with anxiety now, but the news he received in succession made his heart sink slightly. The situation was worse than he had imagined. Lin Feng glanced at Supremacy Divine Jade, then shook his head and said, "The cataclysm has arrived." Just this sentence made Supremacy Divine Jade close his eyes in pain. He knew that the peaceful days the Epic Alliance enjoyed were over. He had thought that if they could completely resolve the problem of the Celestial Devils, they would be able to enjoy peace for some time. At the very least, they should be able to maintain peace for thousands of years. With thousands of years to accumulate resources and plunder world origin and boundary stones, Lin Feng might be able to break through to a quadrillion-level supremacy, or even become a 3-star supremacy directly. But what had happened now? Not long after getting rid of the Celestial Devils, the small Kiliacosms collided. The Epic Alliance did not have much time for peace at all. A vanguard entered from that small Kiliacosm and was defeated by me. However, I can't guarantee that they won't continue invading. Keep an eye on the situation at all times. By the way, how's the situation of the other small Kiliacosm? As the hegemonial faction of the current small Kiliacosm, the Epic Alliance controlled half of the small Kiliacosm. They also had many intelligence channels, and knew everything that happened in the small Kiliacosm. Supremacy Divine Jade shook his head and said, "The situation in that small Kiliacosm is even worse. The place where the two small Kiliacosms collided happens to be within the half of the small Kiliacosm under our control. The pressure is entirely borne by our Epic Alliance, and there is a great deal of pressure. Moreover, according to preliminary contact, no organized team of cultivators has appeared in that small Kiliacosm. They all seem only concerned about their own interests, and there are only some scattered controllers. But the more this is the case, the more I'm worried. Will there be many descenders in that small Kiliacosm? If that's the case, I'm afraid we'll be in big trouble." Of course, Supremacy Divine Jade would have such worries. The more chaotic a small Kiliacosm was, likely, the more those descenders would be attracted by it. Moreover, there would definitely be a lot of descenders. There are also descenders. The medium Kiliacosm factions will definitely reopen the dissension passages. Lin Feng frowned. Even though his strength had improved greatly now, he still felt a little powerless in the face of such a complicated situation. Not only did he have to deal with powerful cultivators or alien lifeforms that might come from the two small Kiliacosms, he also had to deal with those descenders from the medium Kiliacosm, who would be even harder to deal with. If Supremacy Epic were still around, perhaps, Lin Feng had an idea. He thought of Supremacy Epic. If they could save the Supremacy Epic, perhaps the pressure on the Epic Alliance would not be so great now. At that time, Supremacy Epic would preside over a small Kiliacosm, and Lin Feng would preside over another small Kiliacosm. The Epic Alliance would still be able to maintain stability. However, to save Supremacy Epic, they would need at least a 3-star supremacy. 3-star was still very far from Lin Feng now. By the way, how much world origin and boundary stones has the Epic Alliance collected in the past 100 years? Lin Feng looked at Supremacy Divine Jade expectantly. Supremacy Divine Jade also nodded and said, "The gains in the past 100 years are not bad. The Epic Alliance swept through almost half of the small Kiliacosm and killed all the Celestial Devils, obtaining 50 trillion portions of world origin. However, this is almost all of it. It will be very, very difficult to obtain a large amount of world origin in the future. As for boundary stones, including what we got from trading and collection, there are a lot of them. There are a total of 10 billion boundary stones." Lin Feng's eyes lit up. He did not expect the Epic Alliance to have gained so much in the past 100 years, be it world origin or boundary stones. In particular, there were 10 billion boundary stones. Even though more than 90% of these boundary stones were ordinary boundary stones, there were a great amount of them. Lin Feng estimated that it would not be a problem for them to grow into at least 400 trillion or even 500 trillion worlds. At that time, Lin Feng's strength would have a chance of reaching the quadrillion level. In this complicated and grim situation, it was naturally gratifying to be able to increase his strength by so much. However, Lin Feng also knew very well that this was almost the limit of the entire small Kiliacosm. The time was still too short. In just a few hundred years, Lin Feng had almost plundered all the world origin and boundary stones. Next time, even if he had boundary stones, there would not be enough world origin. After all, even the celestial devils had been annihilated, leaving only some scattered celestial devils still in the hiding. What was the point? A quadrillion-level supremacy was almost the limit that Lin Feng could reach in just a few hundred years. As if sensing that Lin Feng seemed a little worried, Supremacy Divine Jade gritted his teeth and said, "Dark Domain Supremacy. The current situation is complicated. There might be another way. It's just that I've never mentioned it in the past, but recently, I learned some news about you, Elder Lin. I think there might be a chance." "What method?" Lin Feng looked at Supremacy Divine Jade in surprise. Lin Feng lacked world origin and boundary stones now. What could Supremacy Divine Jade do? Supremacy Epic. If we can find Supremacy Epic, perhaps the matter of all the boundary stones and world origin that Elder Lin needs will be resolved. Supremacy Divine Jade gritted his teeth and proposed a method that surprised even Lin Feng. Lin Feng shook his head and said, "Supremacy Epic sacrificed himself to suppress the celestial devil ancestor. Where can we find him? Moreover, so what if we find him? He can't leave the Supreme Pagoda either. We can't possibly let the celestial devil ancestor go free, right? Then, we'll have to face a 3-star celestial devil emperor. And the situation will be even worse." Lin Feng even felt that Supremacy Divine Jade was indulging too much in fantasies. The current situation was indeed very tense. But no matter how tense it was, not a single 3-star supremacy had appeared. Even if a 3-star supremacy might appear in the future, that was still a possibility, and a matter for the future. However, once the celestial devil ancestor was released, that would not be the future, but a severe test they would face immediately. Supremacy Divine Jade said, No, it's not to release the celestial devil ancestor. Even if Elder Lin is willing, I'm afraid Supremacy Epic won't agree either. I just hope that Elder Lin can find Supremacy Epic. If you can find Supremacy Epic, you'll have a chance of obtaining the various treasures collected by Supremacy Epic. Although Supremacy Epic also gave most of the treasures to the Epic Alliance back then, I know that Supremacy Epic collected a large amount of boundary stones, including many precious and high-quality 2-star boundary stones. Hearing Supremacy Divine Jade say this, Lin Feng's eyes lit up. He understood what Supremacy Divine Jade meant. In other words, Lin Feng should find Supremacy Epic and obtain a large amount of boundary stones or world origin from Supremacy Epic. This was indeed a solution. Supremacy Epic was the oldest controller Lin Feng knew. Not one of the oldest, but the oldest. From the first epic onwards, Supremacy Epic had already made his fame. He had experienced 8 epical cataclysms and lived through countless years. He was practically the living fossil of this small chiliocosm. Lin Feng would not believe that he did not have boundary stones. On the contrary, the Supremacy Epic would definitely have a large amount of boundary stones and 2-star ones at that. After all, with Supremacy Epic status, only those high-quality boundary stones would attract his attention, and thus be collected by him. If he could find Supremacy Epic from all the descriptions Supremacy Divine Jade had made about Supremacy Epic, he believed that Supremacy Epic would not be stingy with some boundary stones and world origin. After all, Lin Feng could be considered the only hope of the entire Epic Alliance, or even the entire small chiliocosm. However, Lin Feng also knew very well that it was extremely difficult to find Supremacy Epic. Supremacy Divine Jade, do you know where Supremacy Epic is? I remember that before Supremacy Epic disappeared, he severed all contact. No one could find him anymore. Supremacy Divine Jade shook his head and said, I indeed do not know where Supremacy Epic is. Supremacy Epic probably severed contact because he was also afraid that some celestial devils would launch a rescue. Just in case, he simply severed all contact and suppressed the celestial devil ancestor alone. However, Supremacy Epic has the Supreme Pagoda, so it's very likely that he's in the Supreme Spatial Passage. The Supreme Spatial Passage? There's a terrifying pressure inside. Can Supremacy Epic stay inside forever? Lin Feng was a little doubtful. The others did not know about the Supreme Spatial Passage, but Lin Feng knew it very well. He had the spatial disk, and knew the terrifying pressure contained in the Supreme Spatial Passage. Even Lin Feng could forget about staying in the Supreme Spatial Passage forever. Others can't. But the Supreme Pagoda definitely can. Actually, the Supreme Pagoda has always stayed in the Supreme Spatial Passage previously. That's also the safest place. Lin Feng pondered. Indeed, relatively speaking, the Supreme Spatial Passage was the safest place. Without comprehending the supreme rules of space, even a 3-star supremacy could not enter the Supreme Spatial Passage. Elder Lin, you have the spatial disk, right? Supremacy Divine Jade suddenly asked. Lin Feng pondered for a moment. Actually, it was no longer a secret that he had the spatial disk. Previously, he had used the spatial disk in front of many controllers, and even saw the Supreme Spatial Passage. That's right. I do have the spatial disk. Lin Feng nodded in acknowledgement. That's great. If you have the spatial disk, you can enter the Supreme Spatial Passage, and might have a chance of finding the Supreme Pagoda and Supremacy Epoch. Elder Lin is already an elder of our Epic Alliance. As long as you find Supremacy Epoch, you will definitely obtain his trust. Perhaps this is the only opportunity for Elder Lin to quickly improve your strength in a short period of time. Lin Feng pondered. What Supremacy Divine Jade said was indeed a solution. In the current situation, Lin Feng had more or less plundered all the Boundary Stone and the World Origin. In the next few centuries or millennia, he probably would not gain much by relying on the Epic Alliance to plunder World Origin and Boundary Stones. In other words, Lin Feng would be limited by the resources and would not be able to increase his strength rapidly. At that time, never mind having no hope of becoming a 3-star supremacy, Lin Feng probably would not even be able to deal with the current situation. Hence, Lin Feng could only take another path now, and take the risk to enter the Supreme Spatial Passage to find Supremacy Epoch. Lin Feng was a little tempted. This was the only way. However, he was a little hesitant. Could the Epic Alliance and Supremacy Divine Jade deal with the current situation in the entire small Kiliacosm? Supremacy Divine Jade, the situation is complicated now. I'm really worried about leaving at this time. Lin Feng had reason to be worried. Lin Feng had gone on a killing spree previously and killed 4 great supremacies and more than 30 descenders. He had already formed a grudge with those descenders. Now, the collision between 3 small Kiliacosms was happening. Lin Feng had even defeated the vanguard of a small Kiliacosm. The controllers of that small Kiliacosm were ambitious and aggressive. If Lin Feng left, what would happen to the Epic Alliance? Supremacy Divine Jade could clearly see Lin Feng's worry. Supremacy Divine Jade had never felt so powerless as he did now. After all, he was a dignified 10 trillion level supremacy. But in Lin Feng's heart, it was as if he could not hold his own. However, this was indeed the current situation. A 10 trillion level supremacy was really nothing much. All right, 10 years. We'll set a duration of 10 years. No matter how weak I am, if we firmly stay on the defense, and I try my best to restrain the members of the Epic Alliance, we should be able to hold out for 10 years. If Elder Lin can find Supremacy Epic in 10 years, return at that time. Supremacy Divine Jade also made a promise. All right, in 10 years, whether I find Supremacy Epic or not, I will return. Hearing Supremacy Divine Jade's promise, Lin Feng finally made up his mind. He prepared to head to the Supreme Spatial Passage to find Supremacy Epoch. Or rather, it was to find hope, the hope of the Epic Alliance, or even the hope of the entire small Kiliacosm. Elder Lin, this is the exact location of the Epic Alliance headquarters back then. Or rather, it's the location where Supremacy Epoch last appeared. Supremacy Divine Jade pointed at the void in front of them and said, in reality, there was nothing here anymore. Lin Feng had heard a little about the Epic Alliance headquarters back then, and knew a little about the situation. Back then, the Epic Alliance headquarters was the Supreme Pagoda. The Supreme Pagoda seemed to be constantly moving, and did not have a fixed location. When Supremacy Epoch sacrificed himself to suppress the Celestial Devil Ancestor in the end, it had disappeared here. This did not mean that Supremacy Epoch was still nearby. However, this could also be considered a clue. Supremacy Divine Jade, you can go back, Lin Feng said to Supremacy Divine Jade. Then Lin Feng took out the spatial disk. Ever since Lin Feng had obtained this spatial disk, He had actually never used it much and had only used it a few times. Currently, he still had 2 opportunities to warp left. In the past, Lin Feng had hoped to use the spatial disk to comprehend the supreme rules of space, but he had never been able to do so. It was also very difficult to comprehend the supreme rules of space. Even Supremacy Epoch, who had long obtained a supreme spatial treasure, the Supreme Pagoda, had never been able to comprehend the rules of space. Hence, Lin Feng did not force it. Perhaps when the opportunity arrived, he would naturally be able to comprehend them. If the opportunity had not arrived, even if he comprehended them by force, he would not be able to understand the rules of space. Supreme Spatial Passage, open. Lin Feng activated the spatial disk. Immediately, invisible ripples emitted from the spatial disk, instantly piercing through the void in the Kiliacosm domain corridor. A deep and dark passage could be vaguely seen floating in the void. The Supreme Spatial Passage. It was the Supreme Spatial Passage. Supremacy Divine Jade took a deep breath and barely suppressed the emotions in his heart. He shouted, "I hope everything goes smoothly for Elder Lin, and you can return safely." Lin Feng nodded. Then, he leaped and quickly flew into the Supreme Spatial Passage. His figure also disappeared. Looking at Lin Feng's disappearing figure, Supremacy Divine Jade's expression was solemn. He gritted his teeth and said, 10 years. No matter what, I have to hold out for 10 years. Supremacy Divine Jade knew that these 10 years would probably be very difficult, but he had to hold out. This was his promise to Lin Feng, and also Supremacy Divine Jade's responsibility. Swoosh! Lin Feng stepped into the void. He had entered the Supreme Spatial Passage. As soon as he entered, he felt a terrifying pressure that seemed to be suppressing him constantly. Even the current Lin Feng, who had at least 600 trillion worlds, could not withstand it. In the face of this constant spatial pressure, Lin Feng appeared very insignificant. Buzz. Fortunately, a beam of light enveloped Lin Feng's body from the spatial disk, isolating him from the pressure of the Supreme Spatial Passage. Lin Feng could only vaguely sense the pressure in the spatial passage, but unlike before, he did not feel that even his internal Kiliacosm domain would collapse from the crushing force. The Supreme Spatial Passage. Lin Feng arrived at the Supreme Spatial Passage again. He looked around, but realized that his surroundings were empty. There seemed to be nothing, no rules at all. No, it could not be said that there were no rules at all. Stop time. Lin Feng gently stopped time. He only stopped the area in a small range. As expected, the area stilled. Although Lin Feng was enduring immense pressure, it undoubtedly confirmed that even in the Supreme Spatial Passage, the rules of time could still work. The rules of time and the rules of space were the 2 most mysterious and powerful types of rules among all the rules. As expected, they were extraordinary. Lin Feng even tried to use all the other Kiliacosm domain rules in his internal Kiliacosm domain. However, without exception, none of them were of any use. It was as if they had all disappeared in the Supreme Spatial Passage at once. Ha! Lin Feng's heart suddenly skipped a beat, and he had a vague sense of crisis. He saw that the spatial disk seemed to be shaking slightly, and the small grid on the spatial disk was constantly flickering. This also meant that the spatial disk could only hold out for a limited period of time. If Lin Feng did not leave the Supreme Spatial Passage before the power of the spatial disk was exhausted, he would probably be trapped in it forever. At that time, Lin Feng would also be in danger. So, I don't have much time left? Lin Feng frowned. He had not expected such an accident at all. However, on careful thought, back when Lin Feng used the spatial disk, he only warped space and did not stay in the supreme space for long at all. He naturally did not know that staying in the Supreme Spatial Passage also consumed a large amount of energy. According to the spatial energy contained in the spatial disk, Lin Feng estimated that a grid could only hold out for about a month. Since Lin Feng had 2 chances to warp now, this also meant that he only had a maximum of 2 months. Could he find Supremacy Epoch in 2 months? Lin Feng had no guarantee at all. In fact, he could only rely on luck. If he did not find Supremacy Epoch in 2 months, Lin Feng would have to leave the Supreme Spatial Passage. I must hurry up and find supremacy epic. All kinds of thoughts flashed through Lin Feng's mind, and he immediately put them into action. He was unwilling to delay. Actually, with Lin Feng's current strength, he could already sense the unique aspect of the Supreme Spatial Passage. Perhaps if he could focus on studying it, he would be able to have a deeper understanding of the supreme rules of space. But now he was not in the mood to study them. Or rather, there was something more important on his mind. That was to find supremacy epic. The Supreme Spatial Passage was empty. How could Lin Feng find supremacy epic? There was no direction here, no signs, but it was infinitely vast. How could he find him? That's right, rewind time. Lin Feng had a sudden thought, and inspiration flashed through his mind. Lin Feng thought of the rules of time. Since the rules of time could be used in the Supreme Spatial Passage, Lin Feng could use the rules of time to begin rewinding time, and thus find traces of supremacy epic. Back then, the supremacy epic had disappeared here. With the miraculous power of the Supreme Pagoda, as long as it had appeared nearby, Lin Feng would definitely notice it after rewinding time. Hence, Lin Feng simply enveloped an area of billions of kilometers nearby, and began to rewind time on a large scale. Rewind! Lin Feng waved his hand. Immediately, invisible rules of time spread in all directions, enveloping a radius of billions of miles. Lin Feng had never tried rewinding time in such a large range. However, Lin Feng was no longer the same as before. With 600 trillion worlds, rewinding time actually only posed a very small burden to Lin Feng. Hence, in front of Lin Feng, everything within a radius of billions of miles seemed to begin rewinding. Rewinding time seemed relatively easy. Even though the range of Lin Feng's rewind was huge, the burden on Lin Feng had indeed become very small. As time continued to rewind, Lin Feng stared intently at the range of billions of kilometers. Any movement would attract his attention. However, this stretch of Supreme Spatial Passage seemed to be unchanged. It seemed like it might remain completely unchanged even in billions of years. Hence, Lin Feng kept rewinding, but the scene did not seem to have changed at all. Facing the unchanging Supreme Spatial Passage, Lin Feng was also very helpless, but he could only slowly rewind time. From 10 years, 50 years, 100 years, gradually, Lin Feng used the rules of time to rewind this space to hundreds of years ago. It already slowly approached the time when supremacy epic disappeared. However, Lin Feng did not know if he could find any traces of supremacy epic. He could only do his best to find traces of supremacy epic. However, as time passed, Lin Feng became more and more disappointed. He still did not find any traces of supremacy epic. Could supremacy epic not be in this area? Lin Feng could not help but feel a little doubtful. The Supreme Spatial Pagoda could warp through the Supreme Spatial Passage. It would not necessarily stay wherever it had disappeared from in the spatial passage. As Lin Feng kept rewinding time, there was still no sign of the supremacy epic. Lin Feng was already doubting if supremacy epic had ever been to this area. However, just as Lin Feng was about to give up on rewinding time, he suddenly saw a huge tower in the rewind. The Supreme Spatial Pagoda? I see it, I see it. It's indeed here. Lin Feng was very thrilled. He had finally found traces of the Supreme Pagoda. Hence, Lin Feng continued to rewind and analyzed carefully. The Supreme Pagoda should have warped through the spatial passage and disappeared. However, as long as he found a trace of the Supreme Pagoda, it would work. At the very least, it meant that the Supreme Spatial Pagoda had once appeared here. Hence, Lin Feng continued to expand the range of rewind. As long as the burden of rewind was not too great for him, Lin Feng could constantly expand the range of rewind. Then, after finding traces of the Supreme Pagoda, with the point where the Supreme Pagoda appeared as the center, he would continue to rewind time on a large scale. Relying on this rather dumb method, Lin Feng slowly found traces of the Supreme Pagoda and followed it. The Supreme Pagoda seemed to be flying aimlessly in the spatial passage. Or rather, it should be drifting with the current. It was as if no one was manipulating it in the Supreme Spatial Passage. However, only the Supreme Spatial Pagoda could stay in the Supreme Spatial Passage forever. Otherwise, even a 3-star supremacy would not be able to withstand it. Of course, it was impossible for a 3-star supremacy to be trapped to death by the Supreme Spatial Passage. A 3-star supremacy was powerful enough to return directly to the small chiliocosm from the Supreme Spatial Passage. However, to Lin Feng, once the power of the spatial disk was exhausted, he wouldn't have the ability to return to the small chiliocosm. Hence, he had to try his best to find supremacy epoch before the power of the spatial disk was exhausted, and return to the small chiliocosm. Otherwise, it would be hard to say if Lin Feng could still return to the small chiliocosm safely. As time passed, Lin Feng felt that the power of the spatial disk was becoming weaker and weaker. The last 2 opportunities left to warp were probably about to be exhausted. 1 day, 2 days, 5 days, 10 days. As Lin Feng needed to rewind time, he would usually stay for a long time every time he stopped. This also caused his speed of progress to be relatively slow. In addition, the Supreme Space Pagoda was drifting aimlessly. No one knew its established route. Hence, Lin Feng could only search bit by bit. That would take even more time. In the blink of an eye, a month had passed. A grid on the spatial disk gradually dimmed. Buzz. An invisible pressure instantly enveloped Lin Feng. Even though his internal worlds were born at every moment after Lin Feng devoured the 100 trillion boundary stones, and his strength was improving at every moment, he still could not quite withstand such terrifying spatial pressure. Even a 3-star supremacy could not quite withstand this spatial pressure, let alone Lin Feng. Left with no choice, Lin Feng could only activate the spatial disk again and use the last opportunity to warp. Only then could he barely manage to withstand the spatial pressure. However, Lin Feng only had a month left. If he could not find supremacy epoch in the remaining month, Lin Feng would have to return to the small chiliocosm. Of course, Lin Feng would not be willing to return empty-handed. He had to speed up and find supremacy epoch. Looks like I have to speed up. Lin Feng was very anxious deep down, and felt a faint sense of agitation. He did not want to return empty-handed in a month. Hence, his speed of rewinding time increased again. Whenever he captured an image of the Supreme Space Pagoda, he would search for it immediately and strive to find some clues. Soon, half a month passed. Lin Feng used the rules of time to rewind time. More and more images of the Supreme Spatial Pagoda also appeared. He had a vague feeling that the Supreme Spatial Pagoda was about to be found. Buzz. Suddenly, at some unknown location, Lin Feng's spatial disk shook. Just as he was about to rewind time, he realized that the spatial disk was shaking slightly. Lin Feng's heart could not help but burst with joy. There was unusual movement in the spatial disk. This meant that there was some treasure nearby that contained the rules of space. According to this hypothesis, there might be traces of the Supreme Pagoda nearby. Hence, Lin Feng searched even faster. At last, on the 50th day, Lin Feng finally found the Supreme Spatial Pagoda. In the pitch-black Supreme Spatial Passage, the Supreme Spatial Pagoda seemed to be drifting with the current, floating aimlessly in the Supreme Spatial Passage. Lin Feng suppressed the excitement in his heart. He carefully observed the Supreme Space Pagoda, but there did not seem to be anything wrong. However, there was no aura coming from within the Supreme Space Pagoda either, and no one seemed to be controlling it. Lin Feng had to be careful. Supremacy Epoch had sacrificed himself to suppress the Celestial Devil Ancestor. Who knew what had happened? If he accidentally caused the Celestial Devil Ancestor to escape, it would be troublesome. After observing for a while, Lin Feng did not discover much. Hence, he no longer hesitated. He immediately stepped forward and arrived in front of the Supreme Pagoda, staring at it. This was not the first time Lin Feng had seen the Supreme Spatial Pagoda. Even so, he was still a little excited. Then, Lin Feng took a deep breath and shouted, "Alliance Leader. I'm a member of the Epic Alliance. I've been entrusted by the elders of the Epic Alliance to find you." Lin Feng's voice echoed majestically in the Supreme Spatial Passage. Lin Feng stared at the Supreme Pagoda in the Spatial Passage, his voice echoing in the Spatial Passage. However, as time passed, there seemed to be no response from the Supreme Spatial Pagoda. It only stood silently and motionless in the Supreme Spatial Passage. Lin Feng did not know the situation in the Supreme Pagoda and did not dare to act rashly. Hence, he shouted loudly again and again. He even used world power to transmit his voice near the Supreme Pagoda. It echoed continuously. However, no matter what Lin Feng did, there seemed to be no movement from the Supreme Pagoda at all. Could something have happened to Supremacy Epoch? Or could it be that, in order to suppress the Celestial Devil Ancestor, Supremacy Epoch has already become so weak that he has trouble even responding? Lin Feng did not know if it was as he had guessed, but no response ever came from the Supreme Pagoda. This was a huge problem. If he could not enter the Supreme Pagoda despite finding it now, that would be a huge joke. Just as Lin Feng was frowning and about to take further action, the door of the Supreme Pagoda suddenly opened, stunning Lin Feng slightly. However, since the door to the Supreme Pagoda had already opened, Lin Feng did not hesitate anymore and quickly flew in. Swoosh! Lin Feng flew into the Supreme Pagoda. It seemed to be pitch black inside, and he felt as if he had sunk into darkness. There was a faint force that seemed to want to teleport Lin Feng to a place. Lin Feng thought for a moment and did not resist. He allowed this power to envelop him and teleport him away. Only Supremacy Epoch could control the power of the Supreme Pagoda. Lin Feng's purpose for this trip was to meet Supremacy Epoch, so he naturally would not resist. Swoosh! Lin Feng was teleported to a spacious secret chamber. He opened his eyes and saw a middle-aged man sitting cross-legged on the ground at first glance. The middle-aged man's eyes were closed, and he was motionless. Even when Lin Feng arrived, he did not open his eyes. However, Lin Feng drew a deep breath, feeling overjoyed. Greetings, Alliance Leader. The middle-aged man in front of him was Lin Feng's target this time, Supremacy Epoch. Lin Feng observed Supremacy Epoch carefully. In reality, although Lin Feng had become a member of the Epoch Alliance back then, he had never seen Supremacy Epoch. He had only heard various legends about Supremacy Epoch. These legends gradually formed an image in Lin Feng's mind. It seemed to be similar to the image in front of him. The Supremacy Epoch in front of him had sharp brows and bright eyes. His figure was not considered burly, and was even very thin, but it was very upright. Even though he was sitting cross-legged on the ground, his back remained straightened, like a pine tree. Moreover, the aura on Supremacy Epoch's body was actually indistinct. It had even completely fused with the surrounding environment, making it indistinguishable. Supremacy Epoch must have completely fused himself with the Supreme Pagoda, turning it into his intrinsic supreme treasure. This kind of intrinsic supreme treasure could unleash its power freely, and could even exceed its level. Moreover, it could be used at will and conveniently like a part of the body. However, at the same time, once one had an intrinsic supreme treasure, they would be bound together for good or ill. The intrinsic supreme treasure was completely tied to the controller. Lin Feng did not have an intrinsic supreme treasure because he was actually worried about this. Lin Feng trusted his internal kiliocosm domain, his world power, and himself over a supreme treasure. Supremacy Epoch slowly opened his eyes. He glanced at Lin Feng and said, "You're a member of the Epoch Alliance?" "That's right. I haven't been a member of the Epoch Alliance for long." Lin Feng did not conceal anything. "You're really young. You've never experienced even one epochal cataclysm. However, you were born in the wrong era." Supremacy Epoch shook his head again, his eyes filled with pity. This was an amiable and approachable Supremacy, who did not even have any aggressiveness. Lin Feng would never have thought that Supremacy Epoch, who ruled the Epoch Alliance and suppressed the Celestial Devil Ancestor, would be such an approachable and even somewhat plain controller. However, Lin Feng also knew very well that the Supremacy Epoch was definitely not ordinary. "Alliance Leader, I'm here on behalf of the entire Epoch Alliance. I hope that you can return to the Epoch Alliance and preside over the overall situation. The current small kiliocosm is no longer at peace." Hence, Lin Feng explained the overall situation of the small kiliocosm in detail, including the collision of the three small chiliocosms, as well as how they had completely purged the celestial devils and so on. However, Supremacy Epic's expression was still very calm, even so calm that he gave no reaction at all. After a long while, the Supremacy Epic said slowly, "Although the Supreme Pagoda is in the Supreme Spatial Passage, and although I suppressed the Celestial Devil Ancestor with the Supreme Pagoda, I know everything that's happening in the outside world. Dark Domain Supremacy Lin Feng, you contributed greatly to the complete annihilation of the Celestial Devils. Moreover, you are the only hope of the Epic Alliance now, and even the only hope of the entire small chiliocosm. Unfortunately, it's too late." The light in the Supremacy Epic's eyes seemed to have disappeared. He kept shaking his head, his face filled with regret. "No, it's not too late. Supremacy Epic interrupted Lin Feng's words. "Dark Domain Supremacy, you don't understand. You don't understand how bad the situation has become. The collision of the three small chiliocosms destroyed the space of the small chiliocosm. Now, even the Supreme Spatial Passage is affected. The reason why I could use the Supreme Spatial Pagoda to suppress the Celestial Devil Ancestor is that in the Supreme Spatial Passage, the Supreme Pagoda can constantly use the supreme rules of space to suppress the Celestial Devil Ancestor. I can even hold out for 10,000 years. However, after the three small chiliocosms collided and shook the Supreme Spatial Passage, the supreme rules of space were all damaged to a certain extent. Hence, I can no longer suppress the Celestial Devil Ancestor for 10,000 years." Lin Feng opened his mouth, but no words came out. He never expected that the collision of three small chiliocosms would cause such serious consequences. "Alliance leader, how long can you still suppress the Celestial Devil Ancestor for? A few thousand years? Or a few centuries?" Lin Feng asked hesitantly. Supremacy Epic shook his head and heaved a long sigh. "Perhaps I can only suppress the Celestial Devil Ancestor for another 100 years. I didn't expect that the three small chiliocosms would collide. Nor did I expect the Celestial Devil Ancestor to be even more troublesome than I imagined. In 100 years at most, the Celestial Devil Ancestor will probably be able to escape. 100 years! This was simply grievous news. For a moment, Lin Feng's mood was very heavy. Originally, the small chiliocosm had already been in a mess due to the collision of worlds, as well as the Descenders and many other factions. Even Lin Feng could not control the situation. If the Celestial Devil Ancestor escaped again, the consequences would be unthinkable. Is there really no other way? Lin Feng was really unable to accept this. 100 years. No matter how fast Lin Feng's speed of improvement was, it was impossible for him to advance to a 3-star supremacy, let alone be a match for the Celestial Devil Ancestor. Once the Celestial Devil Ancestor escaped, the epical cataclysm wouldn't be the problem. The day the Celestial Devil Ancestor escaped would be the doomsday of the Epic Alliance. Forget it. The Celestial Devil Ancestor will break out sooner or later. I can't suppress him for long. This is fate. It's also fate that after 9 epochs, I still couldn't obtain a 3-star boundary stone or become a 3-star supremacy. I know your goal for this trip is cultivation resources, right? Alliance leader. Lin Feng wanted to say something, but hesitated. His goal was indeed cultivation resources, but it would naturally be better if he could save Supremacy Epic at the same time. Moreover, he wanted to obtain cultivation resources in order to cultivate to the 3-star level faster, and then save Supremacy Epic. But now everything was meaningless. Supremacy Epic had personally suppressed the Celestial Devil Ancestor, and within 100 years, the Celestial Devil Ancestor might be able to break free from the Supremacy Epic suppression. At that time, Supremacy Epic would probably really fall. No matter how many cultivation resources Lin Feng obtained, he would not be able to save Supremacy Epic. At this thought, Lin Feng's heart sank slightly. He looked at Supremacy Epic with a complicated expression. Deep down, he admired Supremacy Epic very much. Even though this was the first time he had seen Supremacy Epic felt like an old friend he had not met for many years. Lin Feng did not feel any discomfort. If Lin Feng must watch helplessly as Supremacy Epic stepped into the abyss of death, while he was powerless to do anything, he was naturally very unwilling. Swoosh! Supremacy Epic waved his hand, and 10 beautiful boundary stones that emitted astonishing rule fluctuations appeared in front of him. These 10 boundary stones were too stunning. Even Lin Feng could not help but be moved. These are 10 100 trillion level boundary stones. They are all high-quality boundary stones that I obtained by luck over a long period of time in several epochs. I originally decided to bestow them to some outstanding controllers. Unfortunately, even Supremacy Divine Jade only reached the level of 10 trillion worlds. He is far from reaching his limit, let alone becoming a 100 trillion level Supremacy. Supremacy Epic seemed a little disappointed. Lin Feng looked at the 10 two-star boundary stones. Of course, he could understand the disappointment in the Supremacy Epic's heart. Supremacy Epic must have placed a lot of hope on the Epic Alliance. He even hoped that the Epic Alliance could give rise to more 100 trillion level, or even quadrillion level supremacies. Then, even without Supremacy Epic, there would still be experts in the Epic Alliance who could hold their own and preside over the overall situation. Unfortunately, the many core elders of the Epic Alliance disappointed Supremacy Epic. Over the long years, the strongest people were only 10 trillion level supremacies. There was not even a 100 trillion level supremacy. Naturally, Supremacy Epic did not have the time to give away these boundary stones. They had been kept until now, but Lin Feng had benefited from them. There are 2 more. These 2 boundary stones are second only to the boundary stone in my body. Originally, I had high hopes for the supremacies of the Epic Alliance, but from the looks of it, they're probably far inferior to the Dark Domain supremacy. I might as well give them to you as well. Supremacy Epic flipped his palm, and 2 more boundary stones appeared. However, when Lin Feng saw these 2 boundary stones, he could not help but feel excited. These 2 boundary stones were magnificent, and they were far larger than ordinary boundary stones. Even those 100 trillion level boundary stones were far inferior to these 2 boundary stones. This was because this was a quadrillion level boundary stone. A true top-grade 2-star boundary stone, second only to the legendary 3-star boundary stone. Seeing these boundary stones, Lin Feng understood that the Supremacy Epic had been waiting and making preparations the entire time. Everything was ready. He was just waiting for the Epic Alliance to slowly give birth to some geniuses and experts. He would do his best to nurture them to become peak 2-star supremacies not inferior to him. Unfortunately, up until now, the Supremacy Epic had yet to see the controller he had been anticipating. Instead, Lin Feng had appeared. Hence, all these boundary stones went to Lin Feng. Lin Feng was overwhelmed with emotions and appeared very excited. Even though he had only obtained 12 boundary stones from Supremacy Epic this time, these 12 boundary stones were the strongest boundary stones produced in the entire small kiliocosm over several epochs. They were collected one by Supremacy Epic, and all given to Lin Feng now. This many boundary stones was completely enough to support Lin Feng to become a quadrillion level supremacy, or even a peak quadrillion level supremacy. Lin Feng no longer had to wait for a long time to slowly plunder boundary stones. These boundary stones were enough. However, with just these boundary stones, finding enough world origin was still a difficult problem for Lin Feng. Swoosh! Supremacy Epic waved his hand and took out a large amount of world origin again. I have about a quadrillion portions of world origin. They are from the countless celestial devils destroyed during the 8 epical cataclysms. I collected most of them and slowly accumulated them. Originally, I wanted to use these world origins to break through and become a 3-star supremacy after obtaining a 3-star boundary stone. But from the looks of it, giving them to you is the best choice. Supremacy Epic was disheartened and practically did not keep anything at all. He even gave Lin Feng all the world origin in his reserves directly. Lin Feng was very excited, even to the extreme. He had once speculated how many boundary stones and world origin Supremacy Epic had. However, up until now, he still felt as if he was in a dream. He had worked hard to obtain all the boundary stones and world origin through the Epic Alliance in the outside world. However, before the 1 quadrillion portions of world origin and 12 high-quality 2-star boundary stones Supremacy Epic had given out, they appeared so insignificant. Lin Feng felt like he had only woken up now. The person standing in front of him was not an ordinary controller. Even the other quadrillion-level supremacies were far inferior. He had experienced 8 epical cataclysms, which was equivalent to collecting resources over 8 epochs. Now, they were all given to Lin Feng, and all of them benefited Lin Feng. This gain had far exceeded Lin Feng's expectations. With these abundant resources, it would be almost a piece of cake for him to become a quadrillion-level supremacy. It was not entirely impossible for him to even become a 3-star supremacy. This time, Lin Feng truly saw the hope of becoming a 3-star supremacy, and no longer just an illusory direction. He saw the path. As long as he walked down it, he would definitely be able to become a 3-star supremacy quickly. Lin Feng bowed deeply to Supremacy Epoch and said, "Thank you for your generosity, Alliance Leader. I don't know how I can repay you." However, Supremacy Epoch shook his head and said, "There's no need for you to repay me. Go. As long as you can fight for a chance of survival for the Epic Alliance and the entire small Kiliacosm, I'll be very gratified." A chance of survival was easier said than done. However, Lin Feng remembered it silently. He looked at the slightly lonely and desolate figure of Supremacy Epoch, and could not quite bear it deep down. Supremacy Epoch was a great figure who had fought for all living beings in the small Kiliacosm for 9 epochs. Could he only watch as Supremacy Epoch reached a most dismal end? Alliance Leader. It's not entirely impossible to resolve the crisis of the celestial devil ancestor. Suddenly, Lin Feng turned around, gritted his teeth, and said firmly with an incomparably solemn expression,